on China in the Second World War for 25 years now. Rana is a man of great distinction, I have to say. He's a professor of modern Chinese history and politics at Oxford University. He's also an officer in the Order of the British Empire, which in British slang is known as having a gong. He has a gong. And he is also a BBC presenter because he is the world's most articulate man, and it was felt nationally that it would be a shame to let that natural resource go to waste. We are going to benefit from it today to talk about this fascinating subject of how the Chinese have slowly discovered their own Second World War. Now, from our Western point of view, this is bizarre because in the West, we've been talking about World War II, since the day it began, and we haven't stopped. But in China, there was long silence. It was a taboo subject for many decades, as Rana's going to explain. It was not touched upon much by the ruling communists until quite recently. And now there has been an explosion of interest from historians, from the government, very importantly. What does this tell us about the new China? On social media and in movies. So Rana, welcome. He comes to us today from Oxford, where he lives. And Rana, can you tell us just a little bit about this explosion of interest?
Absolutely, Simon. Well, first of all, to say it's a huge pleasure to be here, at least be here virtually with you from my front room in Oxford. I have to say that Simon Kuper and Pamela Druckerman are two of the most impressive people writing and talking in the world today. And although I've given a few talks about this book, I felt that they were kind of practice runs until I get to the real thing, which is definitely having to speak to the two here. So I would echo the words, and I can see in the chat function of Barbara PC, who says, this is the best Zoom group. And I think those who know about PanU will certainly endorse that. Thank you, Barbara. And you mentioned that the explosion of interest in World War II is really one of it's the idea that runs through the heart of the book, but also runs through the heart of what I've been seeing over the past 25 years, because I know I've been inflicting my writings on you for about that time, Simon, although I've, of course, read your excellent books on sport and other matters too in return. But when I haven't been doing that, I've been traveling in China a fair bit. And of course, I suspect that many people on this call will have traveled to China. Some may even be from China. Many things, of course, that people tend to notice, the huge economic growth, the increasing authoritarianism of the government in recent years. The Olympics, of course, some time ago, still got a fair bit of afterburners on that. But one thing that is very evident if you look carefully, but I think isn't widely appreciated, is that like many societies in the West, like North America, like Western Europe, World War II is still very live in the public memory of China. And just to give a very, very brief account with like 2 or 3 lines of what this conflict actually meant, I'd like to stress that because I think it's fair to say that most Westerners, and I think looking at the names, most people on this call are going to be from the West, don't tend to have a very clear idea either that China was in World War II in a major way or what happened during that time. So worth just noting, China fought longer than any other allied power in World War II from 1937 to 1945. Its death rate was second only to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union lost over 20 million during World War II. China lost, figures still being compiled in some sense, but 10 to 14 million civilian and military during that time. In addition, China had something like 80 to 100 million of its own citizens become refugees during that period. And also, not incidentally, more than 500,000 Japanese troops on the Axis side were held down by Chinese efforts for 4.5 years until the much more famous Pearl Harbor incident happened. And of course, the Americans and the Brits came along to fight with the Chinese, ultimately defeat Japan in Asia. So this is a very considerable element of World War II that's tended to be underplayed. And in recent years, the Chinese have started rediscovering this, first of all, because they themselves, I think, feel perhaps some justification that the Western world doesn't really appreciate the contribution that China's made to that victory, which is still so important in our historical memory, but also in terms of telling themselves stories about themselves and who they are today. In other words, today, an authoritarian society, but a much richer one, a country that has a very strong consumerist ethic, people's lifestyles are improving, and yet at the heart, maybe a sort of emptiness, a feeling that maybe modern China doesn't necessarily have exactly the kind of center it ought to do. And so popular culture has really taken on board the idea of China and fighting the Japanese as something that the country needs to look back to. And that's been reflected, for instance, in a recent film, the biggest grossing film anywhere in the world this year in 2020, admittedly a low bar because so many cinemas have been closed because of COVID. But the movie The 800, Ba Bai, has basically busted box office records. I think over $300 million worth of tickets sold. And this film has become an absolute talking point in China today. And I think before I say a bit more about that and the wider context and talk to you about it, Simon, I believe we can see a little clip of the trailer. Is that right?
Well, that depends on Pamela. Yes, I believe so.
We think we can.
While Pamela tries to recuperate it.
I'm sure we'll have it in just a moment.
Tell us while she's looking, what is the 800?
Well, indeed. Well, let me just briefly tell you about this film while we're waiting for the trailer to come up. It's worth seeing if we do get it. The film is notable because actually, if I'd been talking to you a year ago, Simon, actually we've been talking about the film The 800, which had just been banned at that point. And the reason for that centers on one of the kind of historical anomalies about the way in which China thinks about World War II today. It's about 800 soldiers, actually more like 400, who basically held a last stand in a warehouse in the city of Shanghai in 1937 at the beginning of the war against the Japanese. When everyone thought that they would be sort of crushed and defeated, they held a sort of last stand before having to retreat. But these soldiers were not Chinese communist soldiers, but Chinese nationalist soldiers serving the government of Chiang Kai-Shek, the Kuomintang or Kuomintang government, which was in China at the time, and of course fiercely anti-communist through most of its history. So that made telling the story very politically sensitive in the China of today. And one of the anomalies is that memory of the anti-communist Kuomintang forces fighting the Japanese has been rehabilitated in today's China, but it sometimes becomes quite sensitive. And that led to a debate around this film, which led to it being banned for over a year. It was supposed to open last year, Shanghai Film Festival, and then it was pulled. But this was the trailer that people got to see.
明天我们将会承受更为猛烈的攻击。敌人来！中水三井一员一弹，也绝不放弃抵抗。船长队断铁！他们来的太多了，已经逼近老铁。迅速布进火力点。走，躲起来！往东边去站起来！
I can't see.
先生们，晚上再见。战况至此，全上海的百姓都会。
That's it. Sorry, for some reason you got the sound but not the pictures, as Malavika was the first to point out. So this brings us to one of the key points about why China couldn't talk about the war, the conflict between the two regimes, the Kuomintang and the communist regime. Now, tell us about what was happening there during the war and why after the war this was such a difficulty for Mao.
This is at the heart of why World War II is such a controversial subject in China even today. Essentially, China, to put it its most simple, was the only allied fighting power in World War II, alongside the Soviet Union, alongside the United States, and of course the British Empire, that really in the years after the war, decades after the war, didn't talk about the war at all, except in very, very limited ways. So obviously in Britain, where I'm sitting, we make something of a fetish of World War II ever since. And even now we talk about it metaphorically all the time. But for the Chinese, it was something that really was off the agenda, except for some rather stylized, rather formalistic descriptions of how the Chinese communists had been involved in defeating the Japanese. And the reason for this was essentially that shortly after the communists and Kuomintang nationalists had fought together for 8 years to defeat the Japanese, they turned on each other in a civil war, which famously was won in 1949 by the victory of Mao on the mainland. And once Mao had got into power, there was no way he was going to give credit to the enemy he'd just defeated on the mainland, the surviving groups of which had fled off to Taiwan, never to return, of course, by saying that actually, you know what, they had a point, and they did actually do something to defeat the Japanese, even if we had to defeat them in the Civil War. And that element of the story basically carried all the way from the 1950s to the 1980s. It was only the 80s when things had changed that the story of the bigger picture of World War II in China started to re-emerge in the mainland under communist rule. So by that stage, Chiang had died, Mao had died. There was a desire to try and reunify with Taiwan, maybe get a little island on side and be a bit nicer to them, and also to soften up the Japanese a bit, and try and make them remember what they'd done in the wartime years, perhaps get some loans or financial assistance off the back of it. So in the 80s, you see a real 180-degree turn in which, for the first time, without ever explicitly saying that's what they were doing, the Chinese Communist Party took the achievements of their old enemies, the nationalists, during World War II, and started to actually allow discussion and even praise, to the point that today, to give one very specific example that I think sums it up really quite nicely, if you go to the outskirts of Chongqing, the wartime Chinese capital in southwest China, today, 40 years ago, if you mentioned Chiang Kai-Shek's name, you would have been told to shush. It was a taboo, you can't even talk about him. Now, his old wartime house where he led the fight back against the Japanese for the nationalist government is kept as a museum. And not only do you have the whole thing kept in this very respectful way with the furniture and the maps, they even have a guy paid to dress up as Chiang Kai-Shek in the grey uniform with a little moustache and beard and shaved head and everything to show you around. So they've really gone the whole hog in rehabilitating him up to getting someone to cosplay him.
So the party decided after Mao's death, actually the war is a pretty useful thing to unite Chinese. And it's also one of the few parts of Chinese history that is quite positive in the sense that the killing was not done by Chinese people killing other Chinese people, which was the story of so much of the 20th century.
That's absolutely right. And actually, you can see this in the words of no one less than the top man in China himself, President Xi Jinping, who more than once in the last few years has said, the reason that we stress the war of resistance against Japan, which, by the way, is the standard formulation for this war in China, they vary between that and World War II, as we would call it, or World Anti-Fascist War, but war of resistance against Japan is the commonest formulation. So Xi Jinping said, the reason we stress it so much is it was the first war where we in China fought back against a foreign enemy and won a victory. And of course, that contrasts it both with what came before, the tragic opium wars of the 19th century, the warlord battles where Chinese fought other Chinese in the 1920s, and also by implication, what came afterwards. For instance, the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s, which you could actually call a Chinese civil war by another name. I mean, bearing in mind that in some cities in China in the 1960s, teenagers were literally hijacking tanks and firing at each other in the streets, destroying buildings along the way. All of that, of course, was no kind of material on which to build any kind of national myth. And going back to World War II, when the Japanese invaded through no fault of the Chinese kept it together, nationalists, communists, whoever they might be, and fought back, that story is still something that can be revived and is worth telling.
This war of resistance against the Japanese, you once stayed in a hostel in Yunnan called the War of Resistance Against Japan Patriotic Hotel, which doesn't rent rooms to Japanese people. So this has obviously become quite a widespread label.
Let's just say attitudes towards the Japanese in China today can be ambivalent. And actually, there's a lot of respect for Japanese technology, Japanese films, Japanese popular culture. But when you get down to it, and particularly in parts of China, even now, where they have folk memory that continues handed on generation to generation about the Japanese, you can get some pretty fierce reactions. So you mentioned that hostel that I stayed in. I have to say that I was not staying there because it was anti-Japanese, rather the reverse. I was actually with a film crew. We're making a documentary, which available through, I think, Netflix and elsewhere, called China's Forgotten War, about this conflict. And on the China-Burma border, which is actually where this hostel was, the only place we could stay, because it was commemorating the Chinese who fought against the Japanese in that area, had this big sign even to this day saying, we do not accept Japanese guests in this hostel. One other example from that region, the southwest city of Chongqing I've mentioned, I'm told there's a local delicacy, I haven't tried it myself, which is a fried egg, and you pour red chili sauce onto it, and it's called Jiadan Dongjing, bombing Tokyo. So make of that what you will.
Mm. And there's been a lot of abuse of Japanese people on Chinese social media where they're called dwarf bandits, which was also a wartime Chinese nickname for the Japanese. And in fact, sometimes this gets out of hand. The anti-Japanese feeling among the population has, certain parts of the population has sometimes become so strong that it makes the Chinese regime uncomfortable.
That's absolutely right, although I'll agree with one qualification I'll say in a minute. But to explain that phenomenon that you pointed out is a really powerful one in contemporary Chinese society. So one of the things that is very evident is that the Chinese state today, the Chinese Communist Party and the state that it runs, is very wary and actually in some ways quite resentful of the idea that Japan should have any kind of higher status in international society. So for instance, a few years ago, Japan was trying to get a seat on the UN Security Council, maybe even a permanent one. And you could see an argument that if there was any revision of the UN structures, then Japan's a rich country, it's a peaceful country these days, pays a tremendous amount of money into the UN, so, give it more status. Well, the Chinese were having none of this. And as well as officially protesting, it was seen that they allowed busloads of students, and one has to ask who was paying for the buses, to turn up outside the consulate, the Japanese consulate in Shanghai, and start throwing bottles and eggs and all sorts of other things that basically spattered the front of the building in protest. And this was in some senses an acknowledgement of a very weird reversal of what people often expect. And a lot of people say, Chinese propaganda is all about, Beijing government saying this, that, the other, and people just obey, almost as if they were robots. But what we know from reading, say, Chinese social media, is that much of the nationalistic feeling is actually very, very real and in many ways, I think misinformed but authentic. And this means that the Chinese government sometimes feels that it too feels worried that if it's not cracking down hard enough on the Japanese, then actually there may be more of an uprising from the population who say that you're being too soft on these foreigners who did so much harm to us during the wartime years. It's very unlikely in the current very illiberal circumstances in China that there will be an uprising for democracy, but I think the likelihood that you get a nationalistic uprising is much more likely. That having been said, I point out that the revival of the memory of the wartime period in China does have quite a bit to do with resentment against Japan, but by far the majority part of it I think is more to do with what the Chinese think about themselves and their societies, just as when the Brits go on, I have to say, endlessly about World War II and talking about Brexit or COVID, all sorts of other things. At some level, they're not really talking about the Germans. They're talking about the Brits themselves and the idea they have of themselves in the world. And I'd say that is actually quite true for the Chinese in their circumstances as well.
But when the regime does war talk or allows or encourages war talk, it also has specific goals. I mean, the Chinese regime uses World War II in what way? What does it want from this?
I think that the Chinese state wants a variety of quite policy-oriented results from its actions. And a lot of them actually are to do with the world of the international arena. So to put one of those goals at its most basic, I would say that one of the reasons that it's been so keen to concentrate on talking about the war is to talk about 1945. And 1945 is a year, obviously this year it's been in the news for a variety of reasons, but basically the 75th anniversary of the ending of World War II in Europe back in May, and then in August, September in Asia. And that's been commemorated, obviously in pandemic conditions in most places, but it's been noted. Now, if you go around the world, I mean, one of the places that I managed to get to before lockdown, and like you and like Pamela, I'm now not going to be going anywhere else for quite a while, was to Germany, to Munich back in February, where the Munich Security Conference is being held. And this sort of discussion of geopolitical issues that they always have there was, amongst others, being addressed by Foreign Minister of China, Wang Yi. And his opening line almost, and something he said elsewhere, and Xi Jinping has said too, is, you Westerners have to remember that China was the first signatory to the United Nations Charter, which technically is true in April 1945 in San Francisco. And by making that statement, he was actually making a much wider statement or implication, which is this. If you look at why the United States, 75 years after the end of the war, still has such a huge set of alliances and presence in East Asia, alliances with Japan, with Thailand, with the Philippines, with South Korea, more loose but real partnerships with Singapore and indeed, of course, Taiwan to some extent, at least unofficially. The basic reason is the settlement in 1945, when America spent blood and treasure and its resources to defeat Japan in the Pacific. So China's argument these days is, okay, that's fine if America gets those rights, but then we too were there. We made all those sacrifices, the figures of which I gave you earlier. We too spent blood and treasure. We fought for 4.5 years before the Americans even turned up in the region. So in that case, on that basis, not only should we get the right to influence the region, but also, and this is the crucial thing, the moral argument that America has, in other words, defeating the Axis powers, that's something that we in China ought to have part of as well. So in a sense, what they want, of course, is the territorial gains and influence that come from having a greater say in the region, but they also want the moral burnishing, the moral freight that comes from being a victor in World War II, who therefore has the right to divide the spoils of the territories in Asia which they fought for.
And I guess China, the Chinese regime has been short on moral freight, being an authoritarian regime. And so World War II is a very useful crutch. We're getting a couple of comments from American attendees who mentioned relatives who fought in China. Barbara PC mentioned somebody, and a lady called Mrs. Elsie also, Angela Elsie. Could you talk a bit about the US-China relationship in wartime and how kind of difficult it was between the two countries at the time?
I'm delighted to do that, Simon. You're kind enough to mention my new book, China's Good War, but I should say that the previous one, titled The US Forgotten Ally and China's War with Japan in the rest of the world, is actually a history of China in World War II, which talks a great deal about the US-China relationship in particular. And the section in that book that is about the US-China relationship, with the British also involved as well, is subtitled The Toxic Alliance. Because I think actually what it points out is that on the one hand, if the Americans had not entered World War II, then the Chinese really could not, I think, have won or been on the Allied side for victory during that war. But by taking on that alliance, they also exposed themselves to a whole variety of factors that really brought the existing regime, the Kuomintang, down to the ground by 1945 and certainly by 1949. In essence, I mean, a whole variety of things went wrong, not least personality clash between General Vinegar Joe Stilwell, my old teacher and comrade in Chinese history at Cambridge. Professor Hans van der Ven has written a fantastic book, China at War, which talks a lot about how Vinegar Joe and Chiang Kai-Shek basically couldn't stand each other. Vinegar Joe referred to Chiang Kai-Shek as the peanut because of his bald head and refused to sort of give him any sort of respect. But in recent years, Chiang Kai-Shek's diaries have been available and been translated, which actually show that Chiang Kai-Shek had his own view. And put at its most basic, it was a clash of viewpoints. The American viewpoint on this whole question, which is the one that you'll still find in most Western books on the subject, is China was a sort of rotten country that was, run by a bunch of corrupt dictators who were always black marketeering and essentially exploited American goodwill and aid while doing very little fighting against the Japanese, and had to be helped out by groups like the famous Flying Tigers, American volunteers who flew over Chinese skies during the war. And when the Chiang Kai-Shek regime collapsed, well, good riddance to bad rubbish. That was the traditional American view. You can find it, for instance, in Barbara Tuchman's classic popular history, Stilwell and the American Experience in China, published back in about 1971. The revisionist view, which I think is much more where historians of China, not just Chinese historians, but actually Western historians who've been using these sources, looks a bit more like the following. China is the first country that gets pulled into what will ultimately become World War II in Asia, although of course it's not. Obviously, that's the case in 1937. For 4.5 years, with a little bit of financial and military assistance, very unofficially, from the Americans, actually the Soviets often get forgotten about, and some financial assistance from the British, but basically no ground troops from anyone else. The Chinese nationalists and Chinese communists get together and they keep fighting the Japanese at a time when the Japanese think they're going to collapse in 3 months, and in fact, they're still there 4.5 years later. It's a bit like Vietnam ahead of time. And then finally, 4.5 years in, the Westerners turn up when they actually find that their interests in Asia are being threatened. And had it not been essentially for the Chinese resistance, they wouldn't have had the chance to do that. And then Chiang Kai-Shek and the Chinese find themselves being given a hard time by the Americans for not being a developed, democratic, prosperous nation like Britain or America, even though they're a desperately poor agricultural country which had been invaded through no request of their own and had been trying to keep the fight going for 4.5 years. So a very different set of views on both sides. And because of the collapse of the nationalist regime, and because of the way in which the United States essentially didn't want to be seen as having any responsibility for the so-called loss of China during the Cold War, most of the blame essentially ended up being heaped on the backs of the Chinese nationalists. So a real clash of viewpoints, as I say, and partly mitigated by the fact that the Chinese communists have adopted at least some of the narrative of the Chinese nationalists these days and regard it more as an American outrage against China rather than a nationalist outrage against the communists.
I am told by Pamela that we have the slide for the Cairo Declaration movie up, and I know that is something that's close to your heart. You're a connoisseur of bad films, and I wondered what you wanted to say about that one.
Let me just introduce that briefly, because I think that will make the point rather nicely, if I may, about why this matters in the Chinese context. I would say if I'm a fan of good and bad movies, that's probably only because I've seen quite a lot of them in your company, I suspect, but nonetheless. This movie, though, gives an example of how some of the phenomena that I'm talking about have come together, including China's attempt to rewrite the narrative of World War II and take it away from the Americans, and the British indeed, and make it much more Chinese, but often with unexpected consequences. So first of all, what they're trying to do. So in the year 2013, there was a lot of reporting in the Chinese press of the 70th anniversary of the Cairo Conference of 1943. Actually, Pamela, if it's not going to be too much of a problem, could you go back one and just show the picture of the Cairo Conference itself, which I think I have there. It's there we are. So that's a picture from the event itself. And for those perhaps who are not familiar with this history, November 1943, one of the major Allied summit conferences, the only one at which the Chinese leader turns up. So he flew all the way from Chongqing to Cairo with various stops in between. You've got Roosevelt, Churchill in his natty safari suit there, and Chiang Kai-Shek on the left-hand side, Madame Chiang Kai-Shek, Sun Mei-ling, fluent American-speaking, well-to-be educated, a voice of China to the world. And by the way, I think in before 1950, probably the single most politically influential woman anywhere in the world, possible exception of Eleanor Roosevelt. So a major figure in her own right. So this event is probably not so significant because of the strategic value of the Cairo Conference, which wasn't that great. But symbolically, it was the moment when China finally got to sit, literally, or China's leader, in equal standing with the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of the British Empire. And symbolically, this picture has an awful lot of value to it. But also at the end, they signed a declaration saying, amongst other things, that small islands which had been taken by Japan during its imperial expansion would be returned to other countries after the war was over. So this is a sort of promissory note, you might say. So fast forward to 2013, 70 years later, and the Chinese state starts getting very excited and saying, look at the Cairo Declaration, look at what was signed during World War II. Those islands that they're referring to, well, of course, they mean those islands in the middle of the East China Sea. They're called the Diaoyu Islands, if you're Chinese. They're called the Senkaku Islands, if you're Japanese. And they basically are disputed between the two sides. And to try and make the case that China should, because of this 1943 declaration, actually have possession of these islands, not only did they make the case in the press and through diplomatic and legal means, they also made a movie about this this declaration to try and give it more popular standing. So, sorry, we have the poster back just once more there, Pamela, of the Cairo Declaration movie poster. Is it? Yeah, perfect. So this movie came out in 2015. And you can see there are actors playing lots of historical figures. You've got Joseph Stalin there. You've got Winston Churchill. The actor who plays Winston Churchill in this movie, by the way, is an American, which gives an intriguing take on his accent to anyone who's a native English speaker. But amongst other things, you can see right there is Chairman Mao in the middle, which is pretty weird since, as I think you might well know, Chairman Mao was not in Cairo at the Cairo conference. That was Chiang Kai-Shek, who you saw in the previous picture. And this attempt by the filmmakers, possibly under some pressure from the Communist Party to make a poster which sort of distorted history in this way, led to huge amounts of mockery on the Chinese internet, I mean, within China itself, from moviegoers who basically said, oh my gosh, these people are trying to be more red than the Reds themselves. And the Chinese internet, which of course is heavily censored, but actually has a pretty wicked sense of humor on all sorts of things, started making alternative versions of the poster to make their point. Pamela, could you do the next one, which has the alternative versions? So this is a small selection of some of the ones that you would find of people who also were never at the Cairo conference, but have appeared on the film poster. We've got Kim Jong-un there, the late Saddam Hussein, the late Colonel Gaddafi, slightly spaced out looking Barack Obama. Anyway, there are a whole variety of people there who clearly feel that. And finally, the filmmakers were so embarrassed by this, they sort of pulled the poster and changed it. The film is actually better than the poster, I should say. But it does make that wider point that even though the state might produce this propaganda, people actually use, I mean, they don't necessarily respond in the way that the state wants. And they also use quite often these ideas about World War II and the popular culture and memories and so forth to pursue their own agendas as well. It's not simply a question of the state pushing top down and having people believe something without any kind of resistance from below.
Now, you've talked about the two main regimes that existed in China at the time, the nationalists and the communists, but there was a third regime, which is almost never mentioned by the Chinese nowadays. Tell us about that, because that raises all sorts of parallels between China and Vichy France.
It does, and you're talking there, I think, Simon, about the collaborationist governments which worked with the Japanese as opposed to fighting against them during World War II. There were actually several of these, but probably the most distinctive and the one closest to Vichy, and actually they ended up comparing themselves in some ways with the Vichy regime, was run by a man named Wang Jingwei, who, again, rather like Pierre Laval, the figure who ended up in charge of the wartime French governments, was a well-known former prime minister of China, was a big nationalist party politician, had been very close to Sun Yat-sen, the great Chinese nationalist revolutionary of the early 20th century, and had actually been very close to Chiang Kai-Shek for a long time, if not exactly friendly. But Wang Jingwei made a calculation in 1938 that was not dissimilar to the one that some French politicians made in 1940, which was the other side, the Japanese in this case, were hugely more powerful. There was no great power, certainly not the United States, coming to save China. And maybe to stop the killings, to stop the bombings, to stop, although we didn't see the trailer, we heard the noise from it, the appalling kind of, killings and shootings and bombings and all of that soundscape rather evoked. To stop all of that, he basically flew to do a deal with the Japanese and set up his own regime. It wasn't a particularly successful regime, and of course, an awful lot of human rights abuses went on under its aegis. But then it essentially became slightly hidden from history after 1945 anyway, because of course with the collapse of the Axis powers and the Japanese, it was essentially shut down and its various members were tried and put on trial and either shot or imprisoned for a time. But the difference is that although in France today there is now obviously quite a lively historical debate about the meaning of the period of collaboration, the dark years, and you get that in popular culture as well. I'm thinking of movies like Louis Malle's La Combe Lucien, for instance. There is an engagement, at least, with the whole Vichy period, even if it's quite partial in some ways. In China, that's been much, much more limited. I would not say there is no discussion of collaboration, but I've been told that it's something that is generally considered not a brilliant way to progress your career if you're a historian. And in terms of popular culture, it's almost always been Chinese outside of the Chinese mainland who have dealt with it. So the Taiwan filmmaker Ang Lee made a film that was very successful about 15 years ago, Lust Caution, based on a short story of the time. I apologize, I think there's a line going off somewhere, but this is the way I'm sure with Pan you sometimes get live for leaking in. It'll go off after a minute, so don't worry. So Ang Lee's movie Lust Caution is one of the rare examples of a film, and again made in Taiwan rather than mainland China, that actually dealt with the question of collaboration and its complexities. But it's fair to say that even today, when you talk about those people in China, they're mostly dismissed as hantian, traitors, and there's simply very little more sophisticated discussion that goes on about their legacy or their meaning.
Last couple of questions from me before we throw it open to the class, and please do send in your questions on chat to everyone or straight to me. You mentioned professional historians. Under how much control are they from the party in what they write about the Second World War?
I think that one of the most interesting things about the historical profession in China on this subject, as on others, is the way that it's a sort of ratchet effect. In other words, that the state does control historians in China in a way that perhaps, I think less true for historians in most liberal societies. But at the same, historians can also make an awful lot of the weather and push away at the boundaries. So when the state decided that, they better start expanding their understanding of the nationalist Kuomintang contribution to World War II in the 1980s, they had to rely on the professional historians to actually do the research and do the history. And what the historians did was to push back very strongly and actually look at a whole variety of things that weren't necessarily what the state actually wanted to look at. So examples of that would be the way in which really definitively, I'd say that Chinese mainland historians showed in the 1980s and 90s that it was the Kuomintang, the Chinese Chiang Kai-Shek nationalists, who actually did almost all of the big set-piece battles and fighting in the first phase of the war. The line had always been, and to some extent in propaganda terms it still is, that the communists really did most of the fighting. The communists actually carried out very important guerrilla warfare, and one shouldn't underestimate the importance of that at all. But in terms of big battles, which are well known in China, not so well known in the West, Shanghai, Taizhuang, Changsha, these sorts of encounters, with one exception, the battle in 1940 called the 100 Regiments, they're all engagements by nationalist troops. And we wouldn't know that, we wouldn't know in the detail that we have it, if it weren't for the fact that China's own historians in Nanjing, in Chongqing, and other such cities have been doing the in-depth research in the archives to actually provide the time, date, place, and details to show what really happened historically. So I'd say that even though there is propaganda control, we Western historians of China cannot possibly write that history now for an English-speaking audience without reading and taking seriously the work of our Chinese colleagues in the mainland, as well as Taiwan.
Last question from me. You're describing a regime which is reaching into nationalist rhetoric in the way that, say, the Yugoslav regime did in the late 80s when communism lost its appeal. Given that the Xi Jinping regime is much more nationalist in its rhetoric than previous Chinese governments, should we be worried about, does this betoken future Chinese aggression?
I think that we should not be overly worried about it when it comes to World War II. There are other reasons, including the fact that there's increasing militarization in the South China Sea. That means that, we should be asking some tough questions of China on this. But I do come back to my belief that the collective memory that's been growing of World War II in China is much more about commemoration and mourning than it is about aggression. And I say that because, to finish off perhaps this little set of thoughts before we take questions, if I think about where I found, I think, the most nuanced and interesting uses of World War II in today's China, over the last 20, 25 years that I've been looking at this subject, it's not actually in the shrill rhetoric or even the bad movies, fun though they are sometimes to watch. It's in, the Chongqing historian who tells me that he was inspired to write about the war history because he remembers his granny, telling him back in the 1950s and 60s about going as a young girl, on foot from her little village to the big city of Chongqing to see the victory celebrations, something that she then couldn't talk about for years because, of course, it was something that was to do with the nationalist government, not the communist government. Or indeed the nationalist veterans who managed to use social media and one of China's best known talk show hosts, a man named Cui Yongyuan, to basically advocate for them to get pensions decades and decades after they'd been denied them because they were on the wrong side. And indeed of cities like Chongqing and Nanjing to remember things like the horrific air raids. London's Blitz is world famous. Very few people remember the Chongqing Blitz, which started 2 years earlier in 1938, but which is now finally commemorated in China as part of that sort of recovery of memory to give respect and mourning to that history. So in the last resort, there is lots that's nationalistic about China today in a very, anti-foreign and xenophobic way, and there should be less of that. But World War II memory is nationalistic in the more accurate sense of the word, in the sense of trying to create a shared nation-state identity. And in that element, I don't think it's any more unworthy or unworthy at all, certainly compared to other allied nations, the British, the Americans, some ways we could say the Russians, who have also used that continuing memory of war over more than 70 years to say something about themselves and what they're proud of in terms of a very different society in the present day. But I don't find that aspect too disturbing at all.
This brings us to a question from Barbara, I think in Miami. Are there any memorials in China for those who died in the war? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Thanks, Barbara. Yes, there are lots of memorials to the war dead. Even during the high Mao years, there were significant numbers of paintings, memorials, and so forth. But the vast majority, not all, but the vast majority were commemorating communist victories specifically in the wartime period. These days, you get a far wider range. And just to mention one specific one, because it's at the edge showing at the edge of what's possible even under Chinese communist rule, is a set of museums just outside the city of Chengdu in Sichuan, run by a man named Fan Zhenchuan. It's the biggest private museum cluster anywhere in China. And just to show how far you can go, I mean, he's also got a private museum there, which is China's only museum of the Cultural Revolution, which is quite something. But he also has a museum of wartime, of World War II. And it's almost all basically commemorating and putting forward memorials of the local contribution of Sichuan province, the province in which the museum is located. And that has proved a very, very powerful and popular place for people from that locality to go and commemorate and mourn and think about the importance of that particular piece of memory. There's plenty of others. There's memorials to the Burma Expeditionary Force down in Yunnan in the southwest, and of course plenty of other places, including of course this movie that you saw or heard the trailer for. The original warehouse that was the movie was based on, where it was set, has now become a sort of pilgrimage site because of the movie this year as well. So there are plenty of memorials, both official and improvised, to the war even today.
Thanks. We have a question from Yuan Chan. He writes, I reported on the anti-Japanese protests in Shanghai in 2005. I had a feeling there was a strong performative aspect to them, although there is also entrenched antipathy. Do you think this is still true, that there is still this performative aspect to these kinds of anti-Japanese actions?
Thanks for that, Ian. Yeah, I think that there absolutely is. I mean, I think I hinted at that actually when I said that these students were brought in on buses, and one has to ask who actually paid for the buses. They clearly didn't come entirely spontaneously, and it was clearly something that was drawing on an authentic feeling, but organising it in a way that was clearly convenient to the state's agenda at that particular time. I think that there is still a performative element, but I think in terms of opposition to the outside world, right now in the year 2020, it's gone in a different direction, by which I mean the following. All the activity and performance and parade and media discussion of the end of World War II, the 75 years since then, this year, has to me, it seems to me, has been much more concentrated on trying to talk about this as the starting point for China's role in the world. And that's why the United Nations and China's role in building the post-1945 world has been stressed as part of that. And the anti-Japanese element, as I think I'm suggesting, has been really downplayed. But there's another element, another war that's just emerged in the last few weeks. And if you look out on Chinese media or reporting of it, you'll see that there. And that's the Korean War, which has had its 70th anniversary of outbreak commemorated this year in China. But the reason for that becomes clearer when you think about what the war is called in Chinese. It's not called the Korean War, it's called Kangmei, which means resistance to the United States. In other words, at a time when China is clearly trying to ramp up its real feeling of anger and resentment that the Trump administration is pushing down so hard on China, reminding everyone about a rather different war, which was not ending with this kind of great resolution, but rather with a confrontation where the Americans didn't do so well, is also quite useful in those circumstances. So there is a very instrumental, and you might say performative, use of different wars for different purposes.
We have a few more questions. I'm going to ask you to be brief on each one.
Yep.
Louise Fay Desprez asks, if the US elects Joe Biden, will that relationship change?
It will not change in terms of the hostility. I think that anger towards China is bipartisan between the Republicans and the Democrats. But I think that the Western alliance, if you call it that way, will gel together under a Biden leadership, which is more probably traditionally internationalist, along with Western Europe, Australia, Japan, to, I think, try and find a more coordinated front against China. The Chinese, I think, will be unhappy at that, but I think these days they're even more unhappy that Trump is so unpredictable that a second Trump term might genuinely lead to a conflict fueled by both sides, since the Chinese are also being quite nationalistic right now.
Reading your work over these 25 years, it started with your account of this communist during the war who claimed always to be fighting the Japanese, and he'd write these accounts of how he bravely fought the Japanese, and you conclude that he actually hadn't really fought them. There was always something that got in the way of him having to fight them. So you've already kind of skirted the edges of a very sensitive subject in China, not just skirted the edges, plunged right into it for a long time now. How much freedom do the Chinese give you to go into their archives? How do they try and watch what you're doing at all?
So far, I would say that I have had nothing but friendly reception in terms of going doing research in China, looking at the subjects that I wanted to, and accessing archives as well. I think it's fair to say that, like many Western historians of China, some of my books are available in Chinese translation in China itself, and some are not. My book on World War II actually, to my surprise and pleasure, went down very well in translation in China. But other subjects, I mean, the book you mentioned that emerged from that first set of researches I did when we were both students in America at the same time, became a book that I know has been read in China, but it was very politely explained to you by various people in a position to know that they thought that it was not possible it could be translated into Chinese and published in China anytime soon, because it touched on that subject we mentioned earlier, collaboration with the Japanese, that is just so politically sensitive that they don't really want to have too much of it addressed. So it is topic by topic, I'd say.
I know that Pamela has a question that she's very keen to ask you.
I mean, it's a more general question, Rana, that I've always wanted to ask you these many years that we've known you, but I haven't had a chance, which is, how did you get interested in China to begin with? What was the genesis of that?
Well, thanks for the question, Pamela. It's one that I always feel I ought to have a good answer to, and I've never come up with a terribly good one, but I'll give you the brief version. When I was back in high school, which is a very long time ago now, I knew that I wanted to learn a language at university, something I hadn't done before. And in those days, we're talking about the late 80s, early 90s, China was not what it is now. It was not the behemoth, the superpower, the new emerging global power that we think it is today. So it was not a piece of sort of prophetic insight on my part to think, let's get in on the ground floor on China. Instead, I think I chose it because at that time, it was probably the most obscure subject you could possibly choose to do. And I have to say that, there weren't exactly that many other people in the room studying Chinese at university with me. So I think that the very one word answer to your question is a perversity, but it also shows that perhaps sometimes taking the perverse choice might actually end up to be much more interesting than you would expect it to be. So I've never regretted the choice, but I can't say it was a very informed one back in the day.
I'm going to put one last question to you from Denise. How possible is it that the government's nationalism is going to boomerang and lead to support for an anti-communist, anti-government movement?
I think the question, thanks Denise, I think the question of whether or not nationalism could boomerang on the party is one of the things that does keep leaders in the Chinese Communist Party up at night. And at the risk of recommending someone's book other than my own, although actually there are plenty of other books other than my own which I would highly recommend, I've just read and really enjoyed The New Red Guards by Jude Blanchett, published by OUP just this year. It's quite short actually, and it reads really, really well. And it's basically about what you might call left-wing neo-Maoist nationalists. In other words, people who want to revive an imagined version of what they claim the Mao era was about. So they don't want to, destroy the entire country as in the Cultural Revolution, but they want to bring back the kind of values of austerity and collective identity. And the problem for the Chinese state with these sorts of protests is that by claiming values such as, we are the real Chinese defenders of the nation state, or we are the real Chinese defenders of the legacy of Chairman Mao, they're making a much harder case for the Chinese party state to answer than this actually, these days, sadly, very small group of people who say, we are liberals, we believe in, constitutional democracy and multi-party democracy, because those people, A, are small in number, B, they're mostly academics, so we know where they live, and C, they usually get arrested and sort of taken off fairly quickly. China's liberals are a highly persecuted and minimal bunch. But these nationalists, I think, are people who the state does find worrying on social media and elsewhere that they could rise up. And therefore, I think an awful lot of what the state is doing, particularly in terms of its very angry rhetoric, is exactly meant to try and appease those groups, because they fear that by not being strong enough in that area, they may find that there is a wave of people saying, you know what, this party claims to be patriotic, you know what, it's not actually patriotic at all. And that's very worrying to them.
So the party needs to occupy the nationalist space.
And I think, in most cases it does so very well in terms of its own aims, because it's got the economic story to tell, it's got this big geopolitical role. It can also use, as it's never really stopped doing, its Marxist-Leninist idea that the world is essentially driven by struggle. And of course, America-China is just the latest part of that. And also, of course, when it wants to, drawing on that long, what you could call it, nationalist tradition of Chinese philosophy, the nation state as defined by Confucius, by Sun Tzu, by Xunzi, a whole variety of philosophers. So there's lots of different strands that you can use, of which modern history and wartime history is just one, although a very important one. But for the Chinese Communist Party, above all, it's very important. People say that the Chinese Communist Party is only interested in keeping itself in power. I think that's actually a slightly empty sort of statement, because essentially, all systems are interested in keeping themselves in power one way or another. But there is a very strong desire, I think, not just to keep the party in power for its own sake, although they certainly want to do that, but also to create this idea of the party as a moral actor, both for its own people and increasingly for the world. The problem is that the Chinese Communist idea of what a party's idea of what a moral actor is in the world is rather different from any liberal's view. But I think we would be foolish to dismiss it as inauthentic because we find it either frightening or unconvincing. That is not the same thing as being empty or hypocritical or hollow, even if, to many of our tastes, it is far too authoritarian and far too top-down in its intentions.
Yes, I mean, this at a time where Uyghur children are being sent to boarding school because their parents have been deported in very large numbers is something else we should remember. Thank you very much, Rana. I greatly recommend Rana's book and his book about the China's Forgotten War, the 2013 one, which is the first full-length account of China's Second World War in English. I also hugely recommend.